Hello, I'm David Anderson. I'm Director General of Amgueddfa Cymru, and I'm going to be talking today about the work that we've been doing at the National Museum Wales, Amgueddfa Cymru, around cultural democracy and cultural rights over the last decade or so. This has very much been a journey of belief on our part and turning belief into practice, and also learning a great deal along the way about the challenges of adopting this methodology. The starting point for us is our context in Wales. Amgueddfa Cymru National Museum Wales has 7 different museums and a collection site, most of which are located in southwest Wales, where the great majority of the population of Wales is based. But also in West Wales and in North Wales too. Our museums have got a very strong industrial heritage dimension, but also incredibly strong collections of Welsh and international art, and really significant archaeological and social historical material. And on top of that, natural sciences collections, some of which were foundational in the disciplines of geology, and biodiversity as well. And we still hold many of the type specimens. So as a museum, we have very, very strong collections, and those provide a foundation for our work as well. One aspect of our lives in Wales, our professional lives in Wales, that marks us out from almost every other country is that we are legally obliged as public bodies, including the National Museum, to implement the goals of an act of 5 years ago on the well-being of future generations. This sets us the challenge of testing every significant decision we make against the impact on the lives of people a generation ahead around, for example, prosperity, health, improving inequality or redressing inequality, working with communities, developing culture and language. All of these things are really foundations for everything that we do, and actually foundations for our work around cultural democracy as well. In Wales, as far as culture is concerned, we have a devolved responsibility. The United Kingdom has virtually no impact or jurisdiction over the way in which culture is developed, funded, supported in Wales, the policies that we operate within. And this gives us a freedom that we try to use responsibly. We are aware that we are nobody's periphery in culture, and no one is our centre. And that applies within the United Kingdom as well as internationally as well. But it does mean that we have to make sure that we do everything we can to take the responsibility as well and to use it well. The cultural rights work that we do is founded on the UN Declaration of Human Rights and Article 27, that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific achievement and its benefits. That's the language of 70 or so years ago, when the declaration was first founded. We then look at how we define it more broadly, and we see that it's about the rights of individuals, of each person, and also of communities too, and of groups of people, to be able to develop and express our humanity, our worldview, and attribute the meanings we give to our existences. And this, of course, brings in almost every aspect of human life: values, beliefs, convictions, languages, knowledge, and the arts, institutions, ways of life. Everything really is encompassed by this, as indeed almost everything of life in Wales is encompassed by our museums, collections, and our work. I think that it can be considered to apply particularly, of course, to creative artists, and very often it's interpreted that way, who are part of indigenous communities and indigenous peoples. minority nations as well within states. So its application is extremely broad. I personally have always taken great inspiration from the work of Henry Shue, an American theorist of human rights, who describes them as the moral minimum, the least that the person can demand. They are non-negotiable. They're not for states to decide that people can or cannot have rights. Each of us has those rights in principle, inviolably. And governments should be expected to respect that. However, to be meaningful, rights must be such as to enable one to affect the fundamental choices as they impact on our lives. That we should have impact on the outcomes, that we should have say in the outcomes, we should have the power to influence public and private organizations. So you can see from this really that when it comes to applying this to museums, this should be empowering our citizens, our communities and individuals very strongly in their work with us. Because at the end of the day, governments, states can sign treaties, as indeed the United Kingdom government did way back in 1948 in support of the Human Rights Act, including the cultural dimensions. But it's really upon us as museum staff and our organizations, and also come to that, other cultural organizations as well, to create the environment in which that on-paper commitment is turned in practice into a real experience or a real opportunity. In other words, the state can promise, but it depends upon us to deliver, hopefully with the state's support. And three dimensions perhaps also to emphasize in this, to summarize it, that this is about cultural representation, it's about cultural participation, and it's also about cultural agency and democratic control. Those are the foundations of the work that we're trying to apply in our museums. I like to refer to this quotation from the British Nigerian writer Ben Okri, actually taken from a television program that he made about 25 years ago, which I loved so much that I decided to get hold of a video from the production company and write down the word, line by line from the screen as it went. And he's describing the impact of the seizure and theft of the great majority of the most significant works produced in Benin at the end, around the 19th century by the British invaders. And they're bringing back to Britain and distribution in the British Museum and other collections as well. And he describes them as the collective manifestation through the artist of the way in which people of that land think and dream and remember and project. And he says when that's lost, as of course these works were lost, were stolen at the end of the 19th century, removed from the land, they are in permanent exile, which is to say one half of them dies. And he then goes on to say that the second thing that happens is that the people themselves are in a source of exile. They're in exile from the repository of their dreams. One of the most effective and tragic ways of destroying a people's spirit is to, as it were, destroy the validity of their works of art. Now, he's describing there the impact of the people of Benin of the loss of their works of art, but that principle can be applied so much more widely to the works that are held in museums across the world as well. And a reminder of the psychic damage as well as the physical damage that can be done by such seizures. If you come to Britain, well, shall we say before COVID, if you had come to Britain, you could well have been greeted on arrival at Heathrow Airport with a poster like this of welcome. And that gives one very clear message to visitors from other countries, and is intended to, of course, it's in a sense it's a corporate and a governmental message. The challenge for us really is that it's not the only message that one can find and could have found perhaps a few years ago in our streets in Britain. in this case, vans travelling around the cities, asking in the UK legally, go home or face arrest. So addressed towards illegal immigrants as defined then by the UK government, part of a declared strategy of creating a hostile environment for illegal immigrants. This immediately sets up a huge tension, really, when it comes to thinking about culture within the United Kingdom, and also thinking about the work of museums themselves as well. Earlier this year, there was a demonstration outside the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, where not just immigrants, but also people of all backgrounds who had been living in Wales for many years, gathered to argue the case for seeing diverse cultural space in Welsh museums. And of course, that message was a message to us at Amgueddfa Cymru National Museum Wales, as well as to museums more generally. We have been working with the Black community in Wales and with many other communities for some years now to redress the imbalances in our collections and to start to acquire a much more representative range of works of art and other cultural items with and from communities. But we have to acknowledge that we're doing all this in the context of a history which is deeply problematic and which has still left its legacy in not just the collections that we hold at the museum, but the diversity or lack of it of our own staff, the representation on governing bodies, and the work we do in almost every aspect of our service. And this is not something which can easily be redressed within just a year or two and some quick changes of policy. One has to also look at our role as museums in terms of our positioning and selective definition of cultural rights. And this is maybe a little bit unfair to the Tate that does a lot more work than this. And of course, nobody would question that their campaign for the release of Ai Weiwei a few years ago, when he was under house arrest, as I recall, was a message that shouldn't be made. However, cultural rights are about citizens as well as about artists and as well as about minority peoples and indigenous peoples. And we can in the museum sector often be very selective about the cultural rights that we choose to focus on. I do find it very strange that the cultural rights are one of the fundamental pillars of the Declaration of Human Rights, and yet we in the museum sector almost never talk about them, never really have the debates at our conferences about how we can be more effective at delivering them. And it leaves me with a question as to why this is. Maybe it's because to really build in participation and agency and influence over service is a very, very big journey for many museums, including many museums that are national museums like my own at Amgueddfa Cymru in Wales, and that it seems to be a daunting task, even if one was very committed to doing it. There is also the possibility that many museums do not wish actually to adopt this philosophy, do not wish to make this commitment to cultural rights as meaningful rights, and that the resistance is actually a philosophical and an organizational one, and is therefore something that will need to be overcome if one believes that cultural rights are genuinely rights and need to be permitted to be effective. For our own work in Wales then, we are rooted in Welsh social thought, which has distinct philosophical traditions. It includes the thinking of Raymond Williams, who died back in the 1980s and whose work around cultural democracy is foundational and has actually had an influence worldwide. He's still, in my view, not celebrated enough, but also the very deep cooperative and communitarian traditions of Wales. It's also about our commitment to agency, to trying to introduce democratic control into at least initially some elements of our work and then develop and grow that. It's certainly around social justice, that we live in unjust societies, and Wales is a very unjust society, in a political entity, a state, the United Kingdom, that has social injustice embedded in it in all sorts of ways. We're committed to internationalism, to working not just with anybody internationally, but those that share our commitments to social justice and to cultural rights, and also to review our ethics, which I think is something the sector as a whole needs to do in the light of the imperative of enabling cultural rights, because again, by and large, they don't feature at all in codes of ethics, and I can't think of one that I'm aware of that really takes that issue on full face. The museum where we started to develop this work most actively first was St Fagans, which was founded on two radical principles: the life of every person matters, and it's people, not institutions, who ultimately are the carriers of culture. We are really only the shell in our organisation for the cultural transmission. It's a large museum site, over 100 acres. I'm sorry, I can't translate that into square kilometres, but you get some sense of it from the map here, and has a multiplicity of old historic buildings that have been rescued from different parts of Wales, as well as a very modernist 70s building that you saw on the previous image. I mentioned that we've been working with Refugee and other communities for some years now. This was a project that we ran about 8 years ago, where refugee groups and asylum seeker groups in South Wales asked if they could take over some of the galleries at the St Fagans Museum, the Social History Museum, and present their own furniture that they had at home, repopulate in a sense the rooms in which they lived, the kitchens, the living rooms, the bedrooms, with their possessions in there, and make that as realistic a representation as possible, and also to be the interpreters in the galleries, talking to visitors as they came through. We also gave space for visitors who came through to try and do the test which everybody who applies for British citizenship has to pass, and found, not surprisingly, that the great majority of people who were born in Britain and lived in Britain all their lives couldn't answer many of the questions themselves. And that was a salutary experience. We got funding from our own government in Wales and also from the lottery to do the redevelopment. And we started to bring in the principle of community decision-making very much from the start in 2012, which objects were to be selected from our collections. In some cases, where there were gaps, could we try with community support to fill them? What stories should be told? How should they be displayed? Where should they be displayed? All of those decisions were up for debate and were very much community engaged. We also grew our volunteer workforce hugely during this period, predominantly to work with street level charities, with homeless charities, asylum seeker groups, Drug Aid Wales, and many others really. And we now have approximately 1,000 volunteers working at St Fagans and other museums to support and work in almost every area of our activities. And very often visitors who come will actually be seeing volunteers working on the site alongside the regular staff. And for each volunteer, there is an opportunity for their own life journey, in some cases directly from the streets through to home again and a more safe life. That the experience they have at the museum is tailored to suit where they are on that journey. And this just gives you a sample of the 120 or so community organisations that the museum, St Fagans and our other museums are working with. You can see we've got Save the Children, we've got the Romani community, the Wallet, which is a homeless charity, and many others. And this is just a small sample. These organisations are now completely vital to the work. They're the beating heart and the lifeblood of the St Fagans Museum. This gives you some sort of indication of unexpected consequences as well as good aims. These boys were a part of a group that was at risk of being excluded from school. They were right on the brink of that. And their head teacher asked if we could do anything to give them a different kind of experience for one day a week, a Friday, outside the classroom. So they came to work with our historic buildings unit, who reconstructed historic buildings from elsewhere in Wales when we acquired them, and worked alongside them. And they loved the experience and bonded very strongly with our own staff. And you would say that would be a wonderful thing to have happened. There was an unexpected consequence, though, which was that all the other children in the class these boys were in heard about what a great time they were having at St Fagans, and decided they wanted to do the same as well, and therefore started to misbehave badly in order to be at risk of exclusion from the school, and to have the chance to do what the others in the class who were about to be excluded would have as well. So we had to completely redesign our relationship with the school so that far more children had an experience like this. But there's an underlying lesson on this, is that what is there about the way in which we teach and learn through formal education that leaves out these kind of opportunities, that means that they're marginal or exceptional, or one has to be on the border of something terrible before they're offered? And shouldn't it be the right of every child to participate in this kind of way, because cultural rights belong to children as well as to adults? We now have something like 200,000 school children a year come to each of our museums, and we're trying to make more of those experiences participative, but that's a huge task with such huge numbers. One of the other new developments at St Fagans was a building which was dedicated to making. We would argue that a human being, very simply and basically, I suppose, is has a heart, a head, and a hand. And museums generally tend to focus on the head, the mind, a lot, and the experience that we have very often, although experiential sometimes in some ways visually, is still very cerebral in lots of ways. Only sometimes do museums move our hearts, and only very rarely do they give us a chance to use our hands. So this building was designed really to make a statement that despite global production, despite supply chains that cross oceans and continents, despite so much of making, certainly in the United Kingdom, being offshored to other parts of the world, making is still intrinsic to being human, and it's intrinsic to ultimately our happiness and our sense of well-being as a human, and our ability to express ourselves, and including expressing our own cultural rights. If we say to visitors who come to museums, you may not do this and you may not do that, then in that case, the message is that you don't have the right to make things. You don't have the right for your voice to be heard and shared in the museum. You don't have the right to share stories, perhaps, that will move other people if they heard them. In other words, our visitors in all sorts of ways, in head and hand and heart, are silenced by us as museums, and we can do something about that. And Gweithdy, the Welsh name for workshop, is one of the places where we really try to redress that balance. And I should say that Welsh is still spoken fluently, or to some degree, by perhaps a third of the population of Wales, and it's obviously an language at one level, but equally it's a language which has got deep roots and roots of thought and practice as well, and which actually has had a resurgence in many parts of Wales too. One of the new buildings that were created at St Fagans is a reconstruction of a 13th century prince's court. The princes of Gwynedd, Llywelyn the Great. This was the court part, a very small part of the court buildings, the Great Hall this would be, from that period in the 13th century. It doesn't exist anymore. This is one of the buildings that we didn't reconstruct and move from elsewhere in Wales when it was threatened. This is one we built on the ground from scratch based on archaeological and other evidence. It's symbolically very powerful for many people in Wales because These great courts were destroyed when the English invaded Wales in the late 13th century and constructed their own castles in their place, and banished or killed the existing Welsh nobility and royalty whenever they came up in battle against them. So for many people in Wales to walk back into a reconstruction of the last point at which Wales had its own state or proto-state 700 years ago is for them an extremely moving experience. But again, it was one that we did through participation, through apprentices, trainees, school children, women's groups, community groups, people who came to us through the street charities. All of their hands are on what you see in front of you on the screen. And actually, there's a lot more now in that space than there was when we took this photograph. Wall hangings that are designed by school children based on traditional Welsh stories and were made by them and also by some very skilled community groups of seamstresses and tapestry makers from North Wales. Many, many hands went into the making of this. But making is only part of the entitlement to cultural rights, because we would argue as well that history is a thinking game. It's not the transmission of information, data. It's in the society we're in now, where in the United Kingdom terms, democracy feels shakier than it was before, in a world in which democracy in many countries is also trembling and shaken too. If democratic decision-making is to be realistic, then it also includes the opportunity to develop the skills of thinking, really, in order to be able to assess the truthfulness or otherwise of what we're being presented with. And we all need those skills of critical thinking and creativity. Museums can champion this, but again, not often enough do we do this and think about it as a purpose. So each of the exhibits in the gallery Wales Is, which looked at the history of Wales through snapshots of events and people, has at its heart a question, a challenge, a troubling story, a reason to think. In this particular case, we're back in the 10th century, and there's a settlement with a ditch all around it, in which about 20 plus years ago, 5 bodies were found. 2 adult males, an adult female, and a teenage girl and a younger boy. And the adult males appear to have had their hands tied behind their backs and to have been thrown in with the other bodies into the ditch. And the initial interpretation that we speculated on, or our staff, our archaeologists speculated on 25 years ago, was that these might have been indigenous Welsh people, and the settlement might have been a Viking settlement, which were emerging in parts of West Wales at that time. And these were local people who were murdered by the invaders, in a way. And it turned out that almost certainly the truth was the very opposite, because analysis of the teeth has revealed that the 2 males were either born in Scandinavia or in the north of Scotland. The adult female had travelled some distance from what's modern-day England into West Wales, and that therefore they were the arrivals, they were the immigrants in a way, who had almost certainly been murdered and thrown into the ditch. And it's a reminder that small nations like very often to have for ourselves a sense that we're different from the big and the colonial nations, but actually our histories are very often much more problematic than that. And so in inviting visitors not to have the conclusions we've come to, but to see the evidence we've come across, we're inviting them also to think about these sort of issues of exclusion and inclusion, and arrival and welcome and unwelcome in all these processes, which are universal ones, which apply as much to Wales today as they did then. This project didn't take place in St Fagans. This was a project that we undertook at National Museum Cardiff, which is where the great majority of the art collections are held, and also the natural sciences collections. And as I mentioned before, we have worked for many years with street level charities, and one of those charities, the Woolwich, approached us and asked if there would be an opportunity for some of their clients who were on the journey from the street back into their own homes to undertake at the museum and do something that could be shared with the public. So our staff, in this case Nick Thornton and Grace Todd, who are in the photograph there, but who you won't know from everybody else who was there, worked with the dozen or so people who had experience living on the streets and being homeless over 18 months to help them to curate an exhibition which ended up being across the whole of the West Wing of National Museum Cardiff, over 5-6 galleries, and all of them are the personal selections of the Woolwich group, and with the reasons why they've chosen those works. So very much connected to personal choice and to the opportunity really to have a voice in some of the most prestigious galleries in Wales. And I'm very proud personally that this exhibition, created by people who'd experienced homelessness, was there for nearly a year in the museum, in the most prestigious galleries for everybody to see and to read and to hear about, and to remind everyone of our common humanity, and that common humanity applies to those people we come across on the streets today, as it does to those who were on the streets a few years ago, and those of us who are lucky enough never to have had to live on the streets too. We are at the end of the day all human, and everybody has the capability of creating exhibitions that will inspire and move everybody else who has a chance to see them. It was called Who Decides because that was the question those people who'd experienced homelessness wanted to ask of the museum. Who does decide what goes on display? Who does decide what's collected? We're also now working with Extinction Rebellion and other activist groups, Black Lives Matter. This event took place about 9 months ago. Extinction Rebellion came into National Museum Cardiff, but we had then got Diplodocus the dinosaur on tour from Natural History Museum, and they wanted to use this as an opportunity to be able to make a statement about the risk there is to humanity and to all life on Earth from the course we're pursuing at the moment. I think almost uniquely among museums in the United Kingdom, we actively collaborated with Extinction Rebellion on this. We welcomed them into the building. We gave them the space and the platform on the day to make their statement about the risk of extinctions, which they did with great dignity and in a very moving way as well, with Dido's Lament from Dido and Aeneas by Purcell being sung from the balcony as part of it. We have a youth forum, a diverse youth forum, and they are increasingly given the opportunity to do interventions into our existing galleries. Some of our galleries have been there for 25 years without changing. The youth forum can certainly change them, and we're also giving them space to present contemporary issues in ways they wish to do. This is a tiny part of, again, a 2.5 gallery exhibition that they staged alongside the Dippy the dinosaur last year, where every exhibit was made entirely from recycled materials and materials they gathered from seashores and other locations across Wales. And it had a very powerful impact on visitors. We had fantastic visitor feedback on this. And again, it was giving space and giving agency and giving voice to people who are not us, not staff, and maybe wouldn't agree with everything that we do as a museum. And in some cases, we might not agree with everything each individual member of a youth forum or an activist group might do as well. But the point is that we can create space for critical debate. And we're now in a situation where there are competing democracies, and historically we as museums, and that includes National Museum Wales, operate within a state action model which is hierarchical, where expertise tends to be in here in the museum, to national frameworks and standards, which are very much more often about protecting objects than about changing society. We tend to be very word and written word orientated, And our accountability is through governments and elected political parties in the UK, at any rate, quite indirectly. But there is another model. There's the citizen action model, which tends to be much more grassroots. It's out there. It's less buildings-based. It's very much driven by local issues and priorities, much more practically orientated, and in certain ways usually can have a much more direct democratic dimension to it. Now, I'm not arguing that the first model should be torn down and the second one only should operate. I think we do need as many models of democracies and as many ways of experience democracy as we can, but that there is a deficit of opportunities for this kind of democracy in our museums, I think, is beyond question. This was a statement published about nearly 20 years ago now through a European Union funded project, and that sadly the United Kingdom no longer can easily be part of these projects. But it makes a very strong statement about the nature of museums and museum buildings, because it says that the museum is not only a building with its contents, this is just the shell. It's something else much more important. A museum has been described as a way of looking and a way of thinking, a place of stories and ideas. It's a natural and cultural history, a world of objects, memories, and the art of living, and a place for debate of all the issues connected with the society we actually live in. And then it concludes by saying, the museum in this sense may exist to some small degree in the building we call a museum, but most of its resources, its nourishment, is to be found outside its walls, mostly in the people in the communities of which it's part. And I think that that's a rebalancing that we have to remember, re-remember, or recreate, really. That the museum is, in a sense, we've borrowed what we have, everything we have, from outside our walls. And that, in a sense, our job is to take as much as we can back into communities and back outside our walls to be effective. What metaphor should we use for our relationship between the museum and society? A faithful servant doing its master's will, even a faithful dog doing its master's will, a mirror that reflects the world back to itself, or a recording angel reporting but never acting. And I think we could see, if we look at the museum sectors in many countries, and my own museum still has many elements of this too, on the journey in which we're trying to move away from, but nevertheless it's been part of us. We have all of those things within us, almost within our DNA, within our codes of ethics and within our sort of practices really too. Can we be more than this? Could we become a museum which has social justice as its centre and makes that the priority of our codes of ethics? And corruption, you might say, what has this got to do with museums? And generally speaking, in the conventional sense, very little. But I was very struck by this definition in the New York Times, which of course was referring to contemporary politics in the United States. I can't imagine who it might refer to specifically, but there we are. And it was describing corruption in essence as the theft of the value of a decision. So it's not necessarily pinching the money from somebody's bank account or that kind of theft. It's the value of a decision. And they went on to say, when someone is supposed to be acting on behalf of an institution, but instead acts on behalf of themselves, they prevent the institution they serve from getting the full value of their choices. This means that every time I make a decision and my colleagues on the staff of Amgueddfa Cymru make a decision, there is a question or a challenge which lies behind us, really, which is there an element of soft corruption in this? Are we choosing people like ourselves? Are we serving people like ourselves? Are we making decisions for our own reputation and prestige? Who's left out of all this? Who might look at us from the outside and say, from where they stand, that looks like a corrupt decision, in the sense that the theft of the value of that decision was taken from them. And in that sense, and just in that sense, I think that there is a lot of corruption in the work that contemporary museums and historically museums have done, because we're not serving all of society. And we can never be content that we're free of this kind of corruption unless we do so. I wanted to finish with this one, which is a photograph I took actually before coronavirus, just before coronavirus hit us in the United Kingdom and the rest of the world as well. And this is clearly designed by one of our major telecommunications companies to give an optimistic statement about what digital technologies are doing. However, some unknown graffiti artists, and as you can see from this presentation, I do go around sometimes and try and capture significant interventions, informal interventions into public space, said the future is not what it used to be, it's far worse. But I don't want to stop there, because I don't think it needs to be far worse. I think we do have a lot of power as a museum sector to make it far better, not far worse. But that is our responsibility, and it's where I come back to the cultural rights and cultural democracy, that that we have it in our power to make the world anew. To go back to that 18th century statement, we do have power in this, and even in difficult situations. And I don't in any way say that the United Kingdom is a country where one feels at any personal risk, physical risk, to be brave inside a museum. And I know there are plenty of museums across the world where that absolutely is true. But I do know that people's careers can be affected by taking a stand on issues of principle in the United Kingdom, and that some of the major agencies and bodies in the United Kingdom would oppose some of the things that I've been saying in this presentation today. We have it in our power to make it different, make it very, very different. And maybe the coronavirus outbreak and the ways we've all had to try to work outside the walls of museums is also an opportunity for us to do a really fundamental rethink of what a museum is and what it is for, and to put social justice and cultural rights and the democratic experience within our walls and within our galleries right at the centre of our work, and work from that foundation upwards rather than work from the buildings and what they hold downwards. And with that, I will conclude, I hope on an optimistic note, this presentation. And I would be very happy to answer any questions if anybody wants to ask them. I know that's a very broad-ranging and possibly quite a controversial one as well. So do please feel free to take issue with anything I've said, to disagree with anything I've said, to offer an alternative model, really, that you think is a better one, or to defend the status quo. And I do realise a lot of people feel there's so much that's good about where we are at the moment as well. Does anybody have a question they want to ask? I really won't be offended if you strongly disagree with me. I'm wondering whether anybody has seen museums in their own area, their own country, perhaps grappling with the issues of cultural rights and what their implications would be in a museum. Or perhaps seen wonderful examples of community agency in museums that could provide a guide for us. And I've got a question from Emily Smith, which is saying that prior to the start of the redevelopment, how long was the process of engagement with such a multiplicity of community groups? And has that changed the conventional staffing structures of the museums? Well, I'll take that in two parts, really. Yes, the museum had been working before 2012 with community organisations, and I mentioned the asylum seeker and refugee communities in South Wales, for example. In truth, this is something which grew from quite small beginnings, say 15, 20 years ago, and expanded and developed and deepened almost year by year as we learnt along the way. And I think that we ourselves initially had little dedicated resource in this area. This again is changing now. We've got a Black History curator. The diversity, particularly within our learning teams and some of our curatorial teams, is growing. And we're beginning to bring community decision-making, as you saw from the St Fagans project, St Fagans redevelopment project, into the museum processes. We are, however, making a review at the moment about how we can make that much wider. We are a Welsh Government-funded museum. We have a legal constitution that means that we have a board of trustees who direct the strategic work of the museum and scrutinise the effectiveness of me as chief executive and others as well in doing our jobs. What we're trying to do is to develop beneath that and alongside that an alternative model which is much more community based, and to start to introduce people who are not staff and come from a wide range of communities into, for example, recruitment. Now we're going to be recruiting a director of corporate services, effectively finance and human resources and related services. And we'll have a panel which will include somebody from outside the museum on that panel as part of the interview process. And we started by doing that on interviews for selected jobs, and we're beginning to roll that out now to a much wider range of recruitment processes as well. But I would say that I'm presenting this knowing and hoping that in 10 years' time, this will be so deeply embedded within the work of the organisation that it would be unthinkable for almost anything one comes across in terms of staff activity and programming not to have included a very strong dimension of community agency. And we're not there yet. We're doing it in part and we're expanding it and constantly developing it, but we're certainly not there to be the museum that I think in, as I say, 5 or 10 years' time, we really should be, and I hope we will be. So thank you, Emily, for your question. Does anybody else have a question they want to ask? I should perhaps just add then that, like many other museums, we have had a lot of challenges over the Black Lives Matter issues, really, the social issues, and also the issues for us as an organisation on this too. And we're opening up a great deal more space now to have opportunities for people from the Black communities in Wales redisplay material, both representing Black history, but also representing the troubled history of Wales altogether from a Black perspective. And within the next month or two, the first sort of significant benefits of that change will be seen, I think, in our galleries as we increasingly reopen. I've got a question also from Kate Neal. Many of these ideas were raised in UK 2007 bicentenary of abolition of slavery. Some of the museums chose to step back and not learn the lessons. Why do you think that was? Well, I was working at a London National Museum in 2007, not at National Museum Wales. And by that stage already, we had got a dedicated team, working with a very diverse team as well, working across Asian, Black, and other minority sort of cultures. So the V&A, I have to say, I think, as I was working at the time, was very much one of the first to engage with that issue long before 2007. That was the 1990s, in fact, that began. But I do remember the experience of discussing where Black heritage should apply to the work of museums, and in particularly national museums at one point, and coming across an argument from a number of other national museums in London at that stage that it was to do with the work of the learning teams, and it might affect the work of exhibition developers in the museums, but it wasn't an issue that should be addressed so directly to the collections. Now, I would stress that not all national museums were saying that, but there was resistance to diversity applying to some areas of the work of national museums from some national museums at that time. I would like to believe, and I think now that would not be the case anymore, but I think it's important to recognise that there is a hidden culture within the museum sector which doesn't declare itself publicly, but nevertheless behind the scenes pushes against social justice and pushes against social change. And I remember being told by one sector leader only a few years ago that museums shouldn't be forced to do this kind of work at all. And I could only say, nobody can force you to do it. You have your own museum and your own sector body, because in fact it came from one of the sector bodies at the time around the Museum Association Code of Ethics. But nevertheless, that sense that it's in some ways people were being forced to follow a route of social change that they shouldn't have to. It wasn't part of the work of museums. It's something I still find ethically really troubling. It's still there in the sector in the United Kingdom. The resistance is still there in certain quarters. It just won't come out and debate it in conferences. I've got a question from Lizzie Moriarty. If I could send a message to the curators of the future, what would it be? I think it would be, I'm sorry we didn't do more. We should have done more far earlier. You're still having to change the things that were wrong with what we did. And we from the past, from your past, apologize that we left it so late before doing it. But I hope you have still, say in 10 or 20 years' time, I hope you've not got as much work to do as the sector in the United Kingdom, and particularly the national museums in the United Kingdom, have to do to make good the wrongs that we've done. And Kate Travers asks, how do you balance these important, challenging ethical approaches to programme and audience engagement in organisations that choose to prioritise income generation? A very good question. I mean, we rely upon income generation in our own museum. We depend upon it. And I do think that in some respects, one has to confront the challenge in this, that if we didn't earn income by selling in the shops, and knowing that some people cannot afford to buy things and some people can, for example, equally the amount of money that we have to do our work, which includes our learning work, our programming work with communities and other audience engagement, might be one of the things that would suffer in this as well. And that's a dilemma I've carried inside me all the way through. However, I do think one of the interesting things about the Future Generations Act in Wales, the imperative to think about the future well-being, is to look at some more creative ways of combining income generation and community engagement, empowering groups, community groups and others to use our museums as a base to learn skills and to have alternative ways of learning an income for themselves. So I think that the income generation inside our organisations and maybe in supporting income generation by communities outside our buildings could be richer than perhaps we've seen it, and that it doesn't have to be A versus B. Sometimes we may be able to find ways of combining income generation and community engagement that are creative and actually help to create a foundational economy in Wales and a circular economy in Wales, where more of the value is kept within Wales and less of it is being produced abroad and actually returning abroad outside the borders of Wales. Because at the moment, the Welsh economy is weak, and there is a huge need for us all, including museums, to be part of developing it sustainably. And I've been asked a question as well again. Are there any museum projects, museums across the world that I've seen that are taking cultural rights to the heart of their operations? I have to say that my experience of museums across the world is far, far smaller than I would wish it to be. And there are far more museums doing wonderful work that I'm simply not aware of. And if any of those museums are part of the audience today, please do get in touch with me. And I hope you can find me easily enough at National Museum Wales if you seek online, because I'd love to hear about it. We work in partnership with an organisation in Latin America called TYPA, who are a cultural agency, and they provide training for cultural workers, including very much museum leaders of the future. And I personally am really inspired by some of the work that I've seen TYPA do, and the stories that I hear from the people who attend courses, where I've been lucky enough to be part of the teaching of those courses as well. We're hoping that we can build up a network of contacts across the world with museums that share a very, very strong and brave social purpose, and who we in Wales can learn from as well. And certainly having met many tens or even hundreds of people at programs like TYPA's, I know that there are very, very many such museums out there in the world. And I wish we had a stronger network through which we could share our experiences and share our work. I feel there is a lack of there's a social justice icon needed, and a place where those of us who are on this journey can meet virtually as well as sometimes perhaps meet physically, to be encouraged to carry on, because unfortunately so much of the mainstream organisations in the museum sector haven't taken this cultural rights route, this social justice route, fully to the heart of their operations. And we need so much to learn from those other organisations that have experience in this. Maybe we should be looking outside the museum sector more as well. I would have loved a question from somebody who disagrees with me. Is there anybody in the audience who would wish to challenge what I've been saying, either wholly or at least in part anyway? I do realise that's, in a sense, in a public forum, that's not something that's maybe all that easy to do. But I do assure you I would welcome that question. I really would. Is there one more last question to give me? If not, then I'll say thank you for participating in the session, and thank you for listening to me. And do please feel free to get in touch with me at National Museum Wales. My email address is david.anderson@museumwales, all one word, .ac.uk. And I'll be very happy to hear from you if you do have further thoughts or good examples to tell me about. So I'll finish by saying diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much in Welsh for participating in the event.